Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gerald Bowie, the president of the Chartered Institute of Journalists, and I'm here to do the domestic stuff, which we always have to do. So thank you very much for coming to this wonderful church, one of Wren's smaller masterpieces. And it's also a very good example of rivers that we never see and don't know are there, because we are actually sitting on the River Fleet, which goes into the Thames. So it's quite an interesting connection. So the domestic stuff. This evening's lecture is in the form of a conversation between Feargal Sharkey and Nick Ferrari. There will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions at the end of the conversation, and there will be people with mics who will come to you and give you the mic. Please announce who you are and what your interest is, and make sure the mic is more or less where I have it. I've been taught this afternoon. Otherwise, we won't hear you because we're actually recording this as well. So, we have a new government. We have a government that's inherited an infrastructure that is failing. We have schools falling apart. We have hospitals that aren't functioning. We have roads that have potholes in them. And we also have rivers that are not clean. And we have water, which as a species we need to survive, which is not being delivered properly. Will this government change that and make a difference? How high is it on its agenda? Ofwat are about to announce their interim report I think in 2 days' time, where there is a possibility they will be asking you and me to pay 90% more for the appalling water and service that we already get. How is that going to be challenged? Well, we have one man here this evening who is an environmental campaigner, also fishes, that's been asking these questions for quite some time. Would you please welcome Feargal Sharkey? Now, the man that really starts most people's days with the conversation of what's on the agenda and who aren't delivering is a man who has the ability to kick up a stink of his own on any subject you would like to think about. So please welcome our host and facilitator this evening, Nick Ferrari.
Here we go. Thanks, Gerald. Thanks very much. Your better side is here, Feargal. May I move you over there? Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I do apologise. I know I look like a drowned rat. I'm thrilled to hear that this is one of the biggest turnouts we've ever had. And I think if you're in the world of media, or I am, or politics, it's quite nice to have a sort of break from it, really. As my Uber driver Rishi Sunak said on the way here. And if you think that's bad, Jacob Rees-Mogg is taking me home. Right, let's get straight to it on a night where there's no shortage of water. Feargal, good to see you again. We spoke a lot in previous careers, I have to say. Yeah.
We have.
You've not gained an ounce. I've gained about the weight of a fridge, but let's move on. As Gerald referenced, change of government, what does that bring to the dynamic of what you're trying to achieve?
A whole new, fresh impetus, oversight, new ears, new eyes, a new approach. That said, what an agenda and what a pile of stuff that a new government's going to have to be wading through. You hear this every morning, 7.6 million people on NHS waiting lists.
Yep.
3.6 million children living in poverty. For those that don't know, tonight there are 1 million children in the United Kingdom destitute, i.e. they have no security where dinner's coming from or where they're going to put their head down to sleep tonight because they don't have their own bed. This is the United Kingdom in 2024. And in the middle of doing all of that, apparently there's a few schools falling down, and the roads are undrivable because they're full of potholes. And in the middle of it,
let's not talk hospitals or schools.
And in the middle is a very irate Irishman going, now about this bloody sewage thing.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's back up a little. How confident are you that water and water quality was the dog that barked or the lion that roared in this election, Feargal?
Very simply, Labour, I'm president of an organisation called SERA, which is the Labour Environment Campaign Group. I've spent the last 4 weeks visiting 64 constituencies, spoke to over 84 different candidates, most of whom are part of the new intake. And I think the most glaring example of all, Lib Dems, 71 MPs, 63 more MPs than the last Parliament, and part of their campaign, a major keystone, was water and sewage and water quality. Broadening that out, the last bit of polling data I saw, 56% of voters were making it very clear that sewage and the scandal was going to influence how they voted at the election. It appears that that prediction was pretty spot on and pretty accurate. We'll talk about how you will keep holding their feet to the flame over that. But I guess we need to go way back. Feargal, why? Why does this motivate you so much? Respectfully, you had an enormous career. You've probably got a few quid in the bank. You don't need to do this. The hassle. It gets slightly Freudian at this part, where I can go, I blame the parents. And I really can't blame the parents. My father was chairman of the Labour Party when there was such a thing in Derry in Northern Ireland, where I grew up, 50s and 60s. He was the branch secretary of his local union. My mother was deeply involved in the civil rights movement, one man, one vote, the right to a house and all that stuff. One memorable moment, 27th of April, 1969. I'm 10, going on 11, I think. Mother insisted my father bundle everybody into the car. We drove to the opposite side of Ireland, where as a family we took part in the People's Democracy Civil Rights March between Belfast and Dublin, protesting injustices. And at 10 years old, I find myself walking down the main motorway between Belfast and Dublin, very enthusiastically waving what I later learned was an anarchist flag. The truth is, Nick, at my kitchen table, the local electrician, housewife, the unemployed, the bricklayer, the teacher, the poet, the playwright, discussed civil disobedience and bringing down the government in Northern Ireland. And as a 10-year-old child, I watched, close up, the housewife, the school teacher, the unemployed, the bricklayer, the poet, bring down the bloody government in Northern Ireland. That's a really bad lesson for a 10-year-old boy to learn.
Let's focus a little bit on water quality, sewage, as Gerald alluded. How have we got ourselves in the situation in which we find ourselves, and that some people are swimming in, effectively?
Well, ultimately, we're all swimming in it. There is not a single river in England that is not polluted.
Is that right?
Every single one. And one of the largest sources of that pollution is the water industry. Personally, we've created a regulatory system that has proved to be completely inept. Bearing in mind, water companies operate state-granted monopolies. So they've got a hostage audience, they've got a hostage market. None of us can choose which company supplies us. None of us can choose how much we pay. There's nothing resembling a competitive market. And in that kind of situation, it might be sensible to have a really robust, hands-on, proactive regulator. Turns out that didn't happen. So the truth is, due to that weakness in regulation, water companies have gamed the system. Or as the FT, in fact, is now referred to, the water industry has become nothing more than a legitimised rip-off.
Well, it's interesting because when I knew I was going to be doing this, I kept an eye out for various headlines and stories, and there was no shortage. And here's one you've just referenced. I'll read it out because I won't think about it. Ofwat sketches out recovery regime to avoid nationalising water groups. And what jumps out here is the idea that they could actually, the water companies, could seek to have no fines levied on them if they gave various assurances. Unsurprisingly, you're quoted in that, but give your reaction here. And I can't read the words out in church that you've said, even though they're on the front of the FT. Give people an idea of your reaction to that.
But the simple truth is, it's an overused phrase. We have been ripped off, we've been scammed, we've been had, we've been abused, our trust in the system and the systems that we create, government, bureaucracies, regulators, and indeed in the companies themselves, that has been utterly shattered. Now, let me just put this in context for you. Ofwat has now, the regulator has now admitted it. Water companies have a legal obligation to build and operate and maintain properly functioning sewage system. That's the job they're in, that's what the law requires of them. Ofwat also now confirms for 33 years we have provided all of the funding necessary for every water company to meet that legal obligation, something that water companies certify annually to the regulator. We've got the money, we know what our job is, we know what the law requires, we've got the money. Clearly it was never spent on the sewage system. So the question we need to be asking, where the hell's our money gone? What happened to it? And when can we all get a refund?
Well, here comes the next headline. Daily Express, I think. Halt dividends over the parasite water debacle. That was just over a month ago. Isn't that where a lot of the money goes?
Oh,
it goes to the
totally.
shareholders, Feargal.
The water companies are now carrying £64 billion worth of debt. An awful lot of that went to pay dividends and was not invested in those companies. In fact, I'm reliably informed Thames Water is a model, and it's not the only one. Thames Water is a model. There is not a single year that Thames Water shareholders have not taken out more money out of that company than they ever put in.
You quite rightly focus your anger at Ofwat. We'll come back to the water companies. Can I talk to you, Feargal, about the Environment Agency, which brings me on to the next headline, which again for the back of the room. That stinks. Our rivers and coasts are filthy, but Environment Quango staff got £9 million in bonuses. Feargal Sharkey.
The Environment Agency, but my starting position, it's what I'm hoping for a new government. There needs to be a complete and utter root and branch review of the regulatory oversight, and that includes the EA.
So Ofwat goes?
Ofwat goes, EA goes.
The Environment Agency
has
goes?
proved itself to be utterly, utterly ineffectual.
How open to that is Sakir and the new Environment team?
I have absolutely no idea, but I suspect over the next week or two, I may be waving my little flag, if not my little angry Irish fist.
Before we biff Ofwat, do they have any teeth?
Oh, they do. They've got all the power in the world. The simple truth is, all of the regulations there, all of the power and authorities there, they simply refuse to close their jaws and bite.
Why?
Invariably, for me, it's back to the boards. And it's a failure of the public appointment process and government secretaries of state appointing to people to boards of Ofwat and the EA that are simply out of their depths and not up to the task that's been required of them. If you go and profile the Ofwat board, invariably what we're talking about with Ofwat, big, proper, ugly, Machiavellian, grown-up Whitehall politics and global corporate financing. There is not a single person on that board with any knowledge, experience or ability to deal with either of those two issues.
The next headline, watchdog useless as sewage is dumped in Windermere. This again underscores what you've just been saying, Feargal.
Lake Windermere.
You recall the Windermere, I'm sure.
Oh yes,
you
no,
yeah.
I speak to them almost on a daily basis. Lake Windermere is a World Heritage Site. It is already turning green with green algae. It has been poisoned by nothing more than greed and regulatory failure. So we're now at a state where rivers are becoming quite unsafe. 3 weeks ago, triathlon at Windsor. This is world-class athletes. 35 athletes got ill after the swimming stage in the River Thames, vomiting diarrhea, and a number ended up in hospital vomiting blood. It's got to the point that every morning at Henley Regatta last week, they're having to test for E. coli levels and advise the athletes taking part in those boating races not to enter the river.
Aren't we also talking in the same year that for the first time ever, the Oxford and Cambridge crews were told, if you've got any open cuts,
correct,
put your band-aid and don't throw anyone in the drink at the end of the race?
Correct. The E. coli sampling done in the days leading up showed levels 10 times above the threshold for safe bathing water. E. coli, by the way, is really, really properly dangerous.
So a little side story from me. The reason I'm motivated by this is my elder son caught leptospirosis or Weil's disease, which Feargal will know well. Fortunately, he was a very fit lad. He models himself on me. He was 17 years old. He went from being captain of the basketball team. For a few months, he could hardly walk across the room, and it was only because of the brilliance of the NHS that I can still count him as my son. and the father of some of my grandchildren. So that is the impact of diseases such as virus disease, Fergal.
Oh, well, it
Killed an Olympic rower, didn't it, virus disease?
It did, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, but it's where we are. It is now only a matter of time before potentially somebody dies because of the state some of these rivers are now in. Where the simple truth is, Thames Water, for last year, water companies spent 4.6 million hours dumping sewage into our rivers and onto our beaches. It is now just out of control.
Just say that number again and let it hang in the air for a minute.
4.6 million hours worth of sewage dumped into our rivers and onto our beaches. And from a court case, I'm also vice president of a fish charity, river charity called Wild Fish, who's the beneficiary tonight of all of your generosity. Last year, Wild Fish took DEFRA to the High Court to judicial review. It came out in the case of somebody like Thames Water, very generically, 60% of that sewage dumping was due to lack of capacity, i.e. lack of investment in the capacity of their sewage works over the last 30 years, and another 40%, very loosely, due to lack of maintenance. They've basically sweated those assets until they're bleeding, simply to maintain the bottom line and secure the financial engineering they've been involved in.
So I've given you some gloomy headlines. Let me share with you one not even a week ago, the Financial Times. Water groups face lawsuits after ruling on sewage release. This, as I recall, is from the Manchester Canal.
Manchester Ship Canal.
Explain to the audience a little bit of the background. How significant do you think this is,
it's potentially massive. Very loosely, Manchester Ship Canal is owned by the people who own Stratford Docks and all of the new hotels and bars and restaurants. And I think they're quite keen on enticing large transatlantic American cruise ships up the Irish Sea, up the Manchester Ship Canal to dock up in Salford and spend their
Get in the clubs and pubs. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's one minor detail in that one of the big locks on the Ship Canal is where the outflow is for Manchester sewage works. So whilst you're on the balcony of your $1,000 a night presidential suite, you're watching the ugly underbelly of Manchester's sewage system drift by you and gently caressing the side of your cruise ship. So the Hill family took United Utilities to court. United Utilities tried to argue that they were exempt because it was up to Ofwat and the EA, and the Supreme Court, in their wisdom and genius decision, ruled that water companies were still liable under that most traditional of English laws, Edward I, common law, that the owner or a renter of the bed of a river or stream or lake can bring action against water companies for nuisance and trespass.
So that means fishermen and fisherwomen, anglers, let's say, boat owners, swimmers. I mean, the door could be kicked off the hinges.
Oh, listen, absolutely. Fish Legal is a charity that advises angling clubs. I, until recently, was chairman of the oldest angling club in this country. We own riparian rights in 2.5 miles of river in Hertfordshire. Case right there.
Let's talk a little bit more about the way forward. Do you think the solution is as simple as nationalisation?
It's clearly a lot more complicated than that.
I feared it might be. Go into more detail.
And I understand people's instinctive reaction. Here's the thing. If we nationalise these companies, and no matter what the chairman of Thames Water might tell you, I can think of any number of ways to nationalise these companies for free without costing a penny.
Seriously?
His example, Northern Rock, went all the way to the Supreme Court last year.
Yeah.
Supreme Court ruled that the share value of a company that was basically bankrupt was nothing. So the shareholders of Northern Rock have got nothing.
And just remind the audience, shareholders are pulling out of Thames Water like there's no tomorrow. The big Canadian companies out, isn't it?
The Ontario Pension Fund just wrote off over £900 million of its investment. It has now rated it as worthless zero. That's the largest shareholder. Has now said its share value is nothing. Oh, no, by the way, I could just go and amend the audit regulations, force them to actually levy and show on their balance sheet the cost of fixing all of this. That's it. They all fail the going concern test. They're all bankrupt right there and then, so I can bankrupt them tomorrow morning and take control of them without doing anything. That, however, leaves a big question mark about the £64 billion worth of debt and how you deal with that and address it, because you do not want the taxpayer having to look at that at a time when we're trying to deal with these 7.6 million people on NH waiting lists and school and child poverty. So for me, I think I would spend a lot of time right now thinking, A, about restructuring and refinancing these companies, because that's going to have to happen anyway, and what we then do to keep their feet to the fire, even if it means them feeling a lot of pain for 10, 15, 20 years to come.
Okay, I've got another headline, which is literally from today, but it concerns Thames Water. While it's likely that most of the audience are Thames Water suppliers, Feargal, this is, of course, being recorded and will be seen right across the country. We briefly touched on the situation in Manchester. Is there any company operating in Britain, that you could point to that's doing a half-decent job?
No.
Even in Wales and Scotland?
No. Wales, as it turns out, is a hybrid model.
But they kind of talk about semi-government ownership.
It's semi-kind of government ownership. It is also the biggest sewage dumper in the whole of the United Kingdom.
Seriously?
Welsh Water, yeah.
Right. And
Scotland is completely privatised or nationalised. Scotland has massive problems with sewage. Last year, over nearly 250,000 hours worth. But here's the thing. They're only monitoring about 3.6% of their sewage dumping pipes have monitors fitted, and they have already recorded almost 250,000 hours worth of sewage dumped into Scottish rivers and Scottish beaches.
It's a grown-up audience. What is the worst case of sewage you have seen? Have you literally, and pardon my language, have you literally seen turds floating on the water?
Yes. Now, frequently you find the water companies say that it's screened. Let me explain to you what that is. Think of a steel mesh 6 millimeters square where the sewage is forced through it either under gravity or under pressure.
What, like at speed?
Like a cauldron, and it simply breaks the big bits up into little bits so you can't actually see them in the river. The easy way to tell, when I mention this, you'll be appalled over the next week or two. Look for the remnants of wet wipes clinging like some demented Christmas bauble on vegetation along the banks of rivers. You will now see it every time you go out and walk the dog.
Well, that's
you will see it.
We've got a lot of nodding heads. Why don't we just briefly, Feargal, give you a second to see. Could you raise your hand if you've seen anything such as Feargal just described, wet wipes clinging? And that, I would say, confidently, is virtually half the audience, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you're not in the least bit surprised by that?
Oh, no, not in the least, because invariably, I now know what I'm looking for. So because they basically mash it, filter it through a sieve, which is what they're doing, you can't see the big bits.
No.
That then leaves, and there are any number of videos out there, and I'm being as delicate as I can about this. There's any number of videos out there right now where you will see ladies' sanitary products,
right,
gentlemen's contraceptive products,
right,
and wet wipes in 1,000 states of being dismantled and torn apart, floating, rolling along the beds of rivers all over this country.
You've been going at this, and credit to you, for some time. Have you ever come face to face with any of the water company bosses or chief execs?
I do, but quite frequently they're kind of desperately keen to speak to me. And I have had desperate kind of policy people reaching out to me going, oh, Feargal, breakfast, lunch, dinner, a walk along a river.
Glass of water.
Come and visit a sewage works. I mean, that's the one that I find really insulting. What the hell have I done in my career would make you think I would want to spend an hour of my life visiting a sewage works? But the truth is, I just go, no. Because we all know what the problems are. Here in southern England, we have these incredibly precious things called chalk streams. They're all massively over-abstracted and destroyed by the water companies. And of course, sewage, and invariably Southern Water, Thames Water, Yorkshire Water, I will simply go, show me the plan and the strategy that you've actually developed to really deal with this in a grown-up, proactive, focused manner, and I will happily spend the rest of my life talking to you about it. But if you think I want to sit over lunch for an hour to be talked at and lobbied by your chief executive, you've lost your mind.
And I don't think they get very far, knowing you as I do. Let's take you back to your roots. You're from Ireland.
Yeah.
What are the water supplies like there? What are the water supplies like in other parts of Europe, Feargal?
Other parts of Europe are much more advanced than us. By way of example, I think the last time I looked, France had about 1,300 dedicated bathing waters designated and assigned where people go swimming.
What have we got, do you know?
Currently we have 3 sections of rivers and all 3 currently carry do not swim advisories.
Brilliant.
And they only came about because of some absolutely brilliant campaigning ladies up in Ilkley in Yorkshire called the Clean Ilkley campaign.
Bless them.
They figured out it was classic Whitehall bureaucracy. How to deal with a problem? Well, just don't have a problem, make it disappear. Well, if we don't designate any bathing waters on our rivers, we don't have to test. And if we don't have to test, there's no data. And if there's no data, there's no problem. What are you talking about? There's no problem. There's a problem with our rivers. There's no data, no science to verify that.
Would you happily swim in rivers in Ireland?
Some I would without a heartbeat.
France?
It is a mission right now and an ambition of the President of France that the Olympics will hold swimming events in the Seine in the middle of Paris this summer.
How is the toxicity of the Seine? I don't know.
President Mitterrand has made it his personal ambition that this will happen. And
Right.
3 weeks ago, we had 35 world-class triathletes.
Do you mean Macron, I think?
Macron.
Yeah.
World-class triathletes getting sick for doing nothing more than swimming in the Thames at Windsor. I wouldn't swim in the Thames in London. Are you mad?
No, I don't
insane.
think that could be. Okay, so I'm going to say the B word, Brexit. How has that influenced, or has had no effect whatsoever?
Well, it has had a massive impact. I'm going to disappear down a rabbit hole slightly.
Sure. I'll pull you back up, don't worry.
In-
I'll throw you a life belt.
In 2012, the UK government was taken to the European Court of Justice by the European Commission and found guilty of acting illegally by allowing water companies to dump sewage into rivers and onto our beaches. It's in breach of what's technically called the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. See, you never thought you would hear those words out of my mouth. So here we are in 2012, the UK government, taken to the highest court in Europe, told you're acting illegally. What did the UK do? Little of anything. And in fact, just before Brexit, the European Commission was about to take the UK government back to court again and ask the court to start sanctioning financially the UK government on a daily basis for non-compliance with the directive. Now, as we know from air quality and car emissions and tests, the European courts did and have fined people billions of euros a day. So we were going there, and then Brexit happened, so the European Court no longer has any jurisdiction. What did the last government come up with? A thing called the Office of Environmental Protection. Have they maintained the same scheme where they could fine the government billions of pounds a day? No. The worst possible thing the OEP can do is send a very angry letter to the minister concerned. That's it.
We're going to come on to the extraordinary pay packages that the bosses earn and indeed their bonuses in just a moment, which I remind you are not in a church, so you can't swear, but I'm motivated, as I've explained, because of what happened to one of my lads.
Yeah.
People clearly are here. They've come out on a fairly balmy, humid night because they're motivated. What do regular folk need to do, Feargal?
Well, the answer to that may unfold on Thursday.
Go on.
On Thursday, Ofwat will announce its interim pricing decisions for the next 5 years, up to 2030. Now, just so you know, the contritionist way that the water companies approach life, Thames Water has applied in real terms to be allowed to increase bills by 59% between now and 2030. But count yourself lucky you're not a Southern Water customer, because they've applied to increase bills by 91%.
What's their justification?
We've been found out. We've got to make all this investment in the infrastructure. There's another layer to this, by the way.
So we've been found out, pardon me, we've been pouring shit into the river, we've now got to put it right. And you're going to pay.
It's not that you're going to pay twice, because you've already paid us to do the job and we didn't. We scammed you and ripped you off. And we're now asking you to pay twice for a service you didn't get the first time round. And running in parallel with this, and I know this is going to sound quite outrageous, London, the south and the southeast, 25 million people are now on the cusp of running out of drinking water because the same lack of planning, strategic thinking and investment has gone into securing London's water supply. And in today's money, the National Infrastructure Commission now estimates simply to keep London's taps running is going to cost 60 billion quid in today's money.
How close to 25? That's nearly half the population. For
Affinity Water, who service Hertfordshire and North London, I think they've now owned up, they've got about 10, 15 years worth of supply left. London is now number 9 on the list of global cities most likely to run out of drinking water. We're now on a list with the likes of Cape Town, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, and Mexico City. And I know I'm in a church, but you just go, good God Almighty, was somebody in charge when all this was going on?
I think you moderated your language rather well. Just to explain, I've got about another 5 or so minutes with Feargal, and then the questions are going to, as Gerald said, are going to come out to you. If you wave your hand or something, someone will come to a microphone. So we want you to get involved. That's very much what this is about. I said that this is today's what they call copy.
Yep.
This will be in the papers tomorrow. Thames Water confirmed it's paid 2 fresh dividends worth £158.3 million in March. As the heavily indebted water company said, it's unlikely to raise fresh funds before December. This is the work of Al Capone, isn't it?
It is exactly that. And the simple truth is, when you add in the previous dividend, I think that now totals over the last 6 or 7 months, 196 million in dividends.
Yes.
The debt has also gone up by another 1.2 billion. Personally, I'm curious because they were supposed last year to spend 1.1 billion on improving and fixing the sewage works. They've owned up they didn't spend that money. So what the hell's happened to that 1.1 billion? The truth is, in my personal view, Thames Water has been effectively bankrupt since last summer, and it's now clinging in there by the fingernails, and government just needs to coup de grace, put it into special administration.
Well, that's virtually the last paragraph of the story, which will be in tomorrow's papers. Thames Water said it's still looking for fresh funding. Investors have pulled the plug on £500 million of emergency funding earlier this year.
Yeah.
The process will not conclude until a key Ofwat decision on its business plan for the next 5 years in, get ready for this, folks, December.
Hurrah.
There's no emergency to this at all. People are swimming in, pardon me, shit, and there is no emergency whatsoever.
I'm going to give you another little flavour on this.
Well, depend on the flavour, but go ahead. I'll take vanilla, please.
Turns out the Chinese government already own 10% of Thames Water. It turns out that that loan they just defaulted on because they needed the 500 million. Shareholders didn't give it, so they've now defaulted on a £490 million loan. I'm given to understand that there is a debt-to-equity swap involved in that loan, and 2 of the biggest creditors are 2 of the Chinese state banks. The Chinese government could potentially now become the largest shareholder in the monopoly that supplies drinking water to 15 million people in London. And you just, again, I'm in a church. I've spent many days over the last few years having what I refer to as what the F day.
Yes,
and that was another one of those days.
All right, almost my time with you is up. Feargal, I first started speaking to you over 40 years ago in a very different earlier life. What sustains you now? What keeps you going in this?
In all honesty, I get into this because...
Have you had relatives who've been ill, just out of interest or anything like that? Or...
Oh, well, I too have had Weil's disease.
You've had Weil's, have you?
I got leptospirosis.
Did it knock you sideways as well?
It took me about 6 months to recover from it.
Yeah.
Like your son, I was out of intensive care, out as an outpatient, and I did nothing more than walk a mile to my local magazine shop to buy the newspapers.
Exactly right.
And I had to go to bed for about 3 days.
Exactly right.
So just walking to the local newsagents.
Yeah.
So it took about 6 months at least.
Yeah. So is this how much does your personal experience sustain you?
Well, let me explain this. I get into this because I was chairman of a fishing club, and we ended up taking the Environment Agency pretty much all the way to the High Court. That got me curious as to why 60 ladies and gentlemen who simply wanted to go fishing had to go to that trouble of walking the Environment Agency to the steps of the High Court just to get the EA to do their job. That made me curious, and that's when 2 things happened. I began to get an instinct that there was something else going on that I didn't understand and couldn't articulate. And I began to realize that this country is festooned with community groups that for decades, the Vere Valley Society was formed in 1976 to protect the River Vere. And for decades, decent people have been filling in petitions outside supermarkets, writing letters to local MPs, writing letters to the Environment Agency. And as I explained to the then chair of the EA, you as the Environment Agency took those people's trust and you trashed it and you abused it because you have known what the problem was, but you were never going to do a damn thing to actually fix it and actually help them. That made me angry. That got me motivated.
Lastly, before we come to the audience, for a degree of balance, I looked up past interviews I've done on this with people such as Rishi Sunak when he was Prime Minister and previous Environment Secretaries. And broadly speaking, Feargal, their argument was no government in the past has ever levied fines at the level that we levy currently. It is the most heavily regulated the industry has ever been. And that's why they're paying the fine. And I always counter, I think the fine's effectively built into the running costs. They just see that as another cost.
2 weeks ago, Anglian Water was fined 2.6 million quid for illegally dumping, polluting a river up in Peterborough. The same week, they paid out another £98 million in dividends to their shareholders. So they just sit there going, well, we've got a kitty, it's about 100 million.
It's an operating cost.
So shall we fix the sewage works for 100 million? Nah, just dump it in. They'll find us 2.6 million quid. Fine, that still leaves us 98 million quid better off. We'll give that to the shareholders. The truth is, and it was my issue with the last government, the European Court told you 12 years ago this should only ever happen in extraordinarily rare, unique events. And by that, the next time you see Noah's Ark coming up Fleet Street collecting animals 2 by 2, it's rained enough you're allowed to dump sewage. So why in God's name are we monitoring something the court told you shouldn't be happening at all? Classic Whitehall response, create a process, make it look like we're doing something, getting busy.
And on an average day, how many discharges are there?
Oh, 800-900 a day throughout the country.
Extraordinary. Right, and now the opportunity for you to get involved if you'd like to raise your hand. Gosh, and absolutely no shortage. There's a gentleman here in a white shirt who was up first, in fairness. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, miss. But that gentleman there, raise your hand again if you would, sir. And your question, you can give your name, but you don't have
Sure,
to.
Richard Perry. These companies are fundamentally very valuable.
Just a little bit closer to
Sorry, Richard Perry. So
hello, Richard.
These companies, I'm half Irish, by the way, so they're fundamentally valuable, and the reason they can get the debt is because they have a nice future revenue stream. So they technically are good businesses. I've set up a fund which I call mutual equity. It's like private equity, but we buy companies and turn them into employee ownership trusts, like John Lewis or Arup. And you can have hybrids where the staff and the the customers and the staff own it. What do you think I should pay for one of these water companies? Because in my book, those investors have lost their money tough shit, to say the word of the evening. Technically, we should pay £1 for it, and then we can own it. We don't need to privatise it or nationalise it.
Well,
what do you think?
Let me help you with this. How hard is it to run a monopoly supplying drinking water to 15 million people? It's a monopoly. There is no competition. There's no competitive market. The regulator sets the price.
Yep. And
yet you have a situation where Liv Garfield, the chief executive of Severn Trent Water, over the last 10 years since she was appointed, has now earned over 27 million quid running a state-granted monopoly supplying drinking water to people in the Midlands.
running it badly, by the way, it's also worth saying.
There you go.
Yeah.
So the simple truth of the matter is, these are massively cash-rich companies. When they were bleeding those companies dry and engineering all of the debt mountains, for those of you, and I'll oversimplify this, it's very simple. You set up a company in the Cayman Islands who loans 10 billion quid, shall we say, to Thames Water. Thames Water then has to pay the interest on that loan, call that 700 million quid a year. And because those companies are related, it's an intercompany loan. And in this country, that loan is tax-free and those interest payments are tax-free. So you've just found a very convenient, totally legal way to offshore 700-800 million quid a year completely tax-free. If I took that money in dividends, somewhere in the world I would have to pay some kind of dividend tax on it. So why would I do that when I can just by a sleight of hand get all that money cash free? So the truth was, that for me is when the regulator and Ofwat in particular should have been riding those water companies, and I do not what condones Thames Water today.
Yep, Thames Water
Chief
today.
Executive, been in the job 3 months, been paid nearly £500,000 quid in 3 months, including a £150,000 bonus. What for?
Bonuses, incredible. Richard, thank you for the first question. Gentleman here in a grey shirt, sir, with glasses. Thank you. Brilliant.
Nick, thank you. Nick Hyam.
Nick.
Hello, Feargal. I wrote a book about water. Can I ask 2 questions, if it's not greedy? One is, you want to replace Ofwat, the regulator, with a new regulator. How do you ensure that some replacement regulator isn't simply, the water companies don't simply run rings around it as they have done in the past. What can you do differently about regulation that would stop that from happening? And secondly, the industry needs huge sums of money spending on it. It's not going to come from the government, which hasn't got any. It's not. You don't think it should come from us, the customers, or not in the quantities the companies want. And the companies say that they are now uninvestable, which is a word I hadn't heard of until a few weeks ago. In other words, they can't get shareholders to invest in them because the shareholders don't believe they'll get a return in the form of dividends. So where does the money come from?
Let me deal with the first one. The boards and senior management teams of both the Environment Agency and Ofwat have proved to be completely incompetent and not up to the job. That is a very different situation, and I probably don't say it enough. When I run into people from the Environment Agency in a dry suit standing in a river, without exception, they are the most incredibly decent people trying really hard to do a really decent job in horrendously difficult circumstances. So for me, the failure was at board level. Now, who appoints the board of Ofwat and the EA? The Secretary of State for DEFRA, the Secretary of State for the Environment. So personally speaking, if I was Steve Reid, I would be clearing out both those boards right now, if not restructuring both those organisations.
But to Nick's point, how will you make sure that the Feargal Sharkey Water Company, or whatever we're going to call it, how will we hold their feet to the flame?
Oh, that comes down to the regulators simply doing the job. Ofwat right now has the power, just to give you an idea, Nick, there is a thing called an enforcement order. Ofwat has the power to order a water company to do whatever it wants. This is how much you will pay your shareholders. This is how much you will invest in your networks. This is how much you will pay your chief executive. And if water companies do not comply with it, Ofwat then automatically has the power to fine those water companies up to 10% of their annual turnover. Guess how many times that power and influence has been used? So the simple truth is, for me, you start with the board, and they're just not up to it. They haven't got the wherewithal, the ability, the drive, and the ambition. As to the financing, it's already been pointed out, there's capital markets out there right now lining up to reinvest and recapitalise and refinance these companies, even if the British government, like happened with Tideway Tunnel, the government has to ultimately guarantee the bond over the next 100 years. There's any number of ways to do this, Nick. It's big and it's easy and it's relatively straightforward. Lend me 40 billion quid, I will pay you 4% off the markets over the next 40 years, and I can't default on it because the British government's going to guarantee and underwrite the bond anyway. There you go, you've done it. It would take an afternoon to put that deal in place.
Nick, thank you. Hands up again. Have we got any? Oh, there we are. Gentleman right at the back with a white blazer and glasses. Thank you. Sir.
So I work for the Financial Times. Many of my colleagues have been writing stories about the misdemeanors of the water companies and holding them to account about their activities. My question tonight is one that applies to us all, really. I'd like to know what you think we as consumers can do to apply pressure to not only the companies but the government, also to the authorities, the regulators. I think they all have a part to play. And I think we all sitting here can feel very insignificant in this big, important issue, one that affects us all. What exactly can we do? Should we be organising little groups to put pressure on companies? Should we stop paying our water bills? Do you have any clues for us? Any tips?
Well, let me start with the insignificant bit. As the last 7 days have proved, when the great British public roars in a general election, by God, does it reverberate through the country. And I have absolutely no doubt, and I will defend it, there are people inducted into Parliament today who are there because of the sewage crisis. And I can tell you right now, the 4 Labour MPs from Cornwall, they're there because of sewage. There's a whole...
Do they know that, Feargal?
Yes.
Will they act on that?
Funnily enough, one of them was acting on it this afternoon.
OK, on you go.
Where constituents have already been in touch. This afternoon, there's been massive sewage dumping going on along the south coast of Cornwall. So for me, I think people underestimate the power of the voice. But you're talking to a guy that grew up in a kitchen where the electrician, the plumber and the housewife brought down the national government in Northern Ireland. You can do it if you want to, and the last election proved it. Me personally, I'm giving up Ofwat until Thursday. And I have a sneaky suspicion that Ofwat will not be making a decision about the future of the water companies and the pricing, but a decision about its own future. And depending on what happens, I might come back to you on this, but I will be on Good Morning Britain on Thursday morning. Tune in, because I may have a lot to say about what normal people can do if this goes the way I think it's going to go.
And after GMB, you'll be on LBC.
And I think that lion may need to roar even louder.
So the news drops on Wednesday night, just to clarify, does it? So then you can respond on Thursday morning?
Invariably,
hang on, tomorrow night, yeah.
It'll be embargoed until midnight tomorrow night.
And you're in GMB Thursday morning. And then with me after that. We'll talk about that later. Simon, thank you. Gosh, so many questions. Can we possibly come up to this gentleman here? I know it's a long sprint, but he's tried to, and I will try and get to as many. We've got a good amount of time, actually, but this gentleman's waving at me, hopefully to ask a question. Sir, in the white shirt.
Good evening, Mark Cable. I used to be a government press officer in the Major administration,
You're
so going back
kidding me.
a long time.
And I guess you've no sympathy at all for Defra's press office over the last 5 years.
The question I've got, I believe
Nice and close to your mouth,
Ofwat's relationship with the water companies is quite incestuous, and they cross-employ. So therefore, there's a reason why they don't get involved in too much in Ofwat, because they could end up working for the water companies. Second point, I think Thames Water, I believe today, said publicly they're running out of money in 2025.
Yeah.
And thirdly, just a point for you that you already know about. Should I believe that the dividends have been given back to the shareholders rather than doing the investment that was required.
Oh, in the case, shall we?
And is there? Yeah, I'll leave this after. This is it. And is there any way that money can be recouped?
Getting the money back? No.
Thank you.
It's gone. It's gone. Reversing, I'll go 3, 2, 1 if that's okay. I'm very reliably informed in a bunch of people who did a complete forensic audit on Thames Water in particular, and every other water company, but Thames Water specifically. There is not a single year in Thames Water's existence that the shareholders did not take more money out of the company than they ever put in. Not a single year. So when water companies say they're investing, it's a lie. You are paying for it out of your bill. It's not costing the shareholders a penny, or rarely, if indeed anything. Going back to, what was the first question? There are days that I'm sure...
No, on a regular basis. It was Ofwat. Remind me of the question.
I've got it.
Ofwat crossing point, yeah.
There are days, and I'm sure some of you have all had this, Nick certainly has,
yes,
when you just go, really? A year ago, yet another chief executive from Thames Water was fired, Sarah Bentley. They appoint a dual temporary chief executives. The lady concerned was a lady called Catherine Ross. And of course, as you may or not be aware, water companies have an operating licence issued by government, but actually physically written out by Ofwat. And I dug out Thames Water's operating licence, signed by the then chief executive of Ofwat, one Catherine Ross. By God, is that the same Catherine Ross? Of course it is. And you just sit there and go, could you make this hard for me? That there is the paperwork, there's Catherine Ross's signature at the bottom of Thames Water's operating licence, signed by the chief executive of the regulator, and suddenly she's appointed interim chief executive of the very aforementioned Thames Water. You can't make this stuff up.
Deals within deals. Hands up again if we would. Okay, gentleman here in a dark jacket with a green tie, I think. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Alistair Collett. My question for you, Feargal, is should the government be advised by you to revise the civil and criminal sanctions that apply to water companies, other utilities and their directors?
And what's your name, sir, so we can refer to you?
Alistair Collett.
Alistair, thank you.
The Labour Party, and I can't speak on behalf of the Labour Party, the Labour Party were campaigning quite hard on that very idea during the election. That law should be amended, introduced to criminalise and, if necessary, jail executives and water companies, and to be able to limit bonuses and all that kind of thing. That was because it was showing up really, really well in the focus group and the polling. And as Nick already knows, for me, that was actually an insight into the level of rage and fury and anger that exists in the general public. They want punitive measures brought against these companies by way of revenge. And that is a conversation we're going to have over the next couple of weeks.
Well, let's see. I mean, would you agree that something like that someone who is repeatedly criminally incompetent and poisoning, if you'd like a round of applause or something, or a raise of hands, would you agree that... I thought as much. Thank you. I remember saying that on Question Time about a year and a half ago. It's the only positive reaction I've ever had appearing on Question Time. There's a gentleman in a blue sweater.
Indeed. You,
yes.
Sir. Oh, well, I shall speak more slowly, sir, if that helps.
I thought, do you want us to start from the beginning? We'll raise our voice. Let's go. I'm sorry about that. Let's make sure. Another question, if we could, please. Do we have another? Oh, yes, please, can we come here to a young woman in a pink top, if we can? And I will speak even louder, sir, for you. If we could get a first name, that would help enormously.
You can take me to the pub afterwards and buy me a drink, and I'll give you a replay.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Maggie, and
hello, Maggie.
I have kind of come to this from a wild swimming background. Oh, sorry.
That's great.
Is that okay?
Well
from a wild swimming background, and I wondered, do you think if change does happen, we could get to the point as a country where sort of Austria and Germany are, where 70% plus of their waterways are safe for swimming, or do you think it's too late?
So Austria and Germany have 70% of their waterways in which Maggie says we can all take a dip. Feargal, could we ever get to that level?
Well, there's no reason we can't, because all these water companies have to do is comply with the law. Because guess what? It's the same law there as it is here. And like a lot of this stuff, it all pans out from a pan-European directive that's then rolled out and implemented in each member state. And here in the UK, it was implemented in 1994. So it's been the law for 20 years, 30 years. So shall we just get on with it and apply it like everywhere else?
To pick it up a little on what Nick might have said, do they have tougher regulators in Austria and Germany?
Oh, they do, because they just don't take that kind of nonsense. And when you have... They don't take that kind of shit.
Yeah.
And when you have the president of the country standing up and going, I would quite like Olympic swimmers to be able to swim in the middle of the Seine this summer. Well, guess what happens?
Right.
There's a whole bunch of people get really busy and make things happen. The truth is, it created this vacuum, that failure of the regulation. And I'm sorry I keep harping on about it, but I say that as a former regulator, by the way. The system of regulation failed. That creates a vacuum, and the water companies filled that vacuum. And they pushed it, and they pushed it, and they pushed it, and I've actually got a kind of sneaky small bit of empathy for the water companies, because the law is quite clear. Their job is to make as much bloody money as they possibly can for their shareholders, so they're just going to push it until the regulator says, don't do that. The regulator developed this notion, schoolboy, sixth form, A-level economics vanity project called reputational regulation. The regulator actually still thinks that if they simply name and shame these companies often enough in public, that some deeply embedded sense of Christian decency will finally kick in and they'll do the right thing. And of course, my response was, well, if he spoke to the Communist Party in China about all of this, do they even know that they own?
Yeah.
So it was just a total vanity project in terms of regulation. And it was, I think they also made this mistake because there's no competitive market. They were trying to, as some kind of, again, O-level economics test, trying to develop what they thought might look like a competitive market. But we're now in the situation, half of these companies, more than them, are what I refer to as an intensive care unit financially. They're teetering the brink of bankruptcy. Thursday's going to be a very big day for them, and a very big day for the regulator, and more importantly, a very big day for the 65 million people in this country that have been held hostage by the bloody water industry and a regulator that's completely hopeless.
Well, I don't think Gerald could have picked the timing better for today. I think we're coming to our last 4 or 5 minutes. There's a gentleman here in a beige, caramel kind of jacket waving at me. If I could get, hello again, sir. Yes, if I could get your first name and then your question.
Name's Robert Gibbs.
Hello, Robert.
Good evening. Just as, let's say, Alfa Romeos used to fall apart until...
Bit closer to your mouth if you would, sir.
Just as Alfa Romeos used to fall apart until they got the Volvo engineers in, could we not poach the German overseers of the water authorities?
Right, so England's going to be playing in Germany for the football. The suggestion is, why don't we go and take whatever they're doing well in Germany, or even Austria, why don't we just go and buy it wholesale and bring them over here?
You see, funny enough, that's water companies will give you that classical thing, and the last company did, oh, it's all terribly clever and terribly complicated. And I sit there going, well, hang on, Thames Water leaks. 25% of the water that they try to supply every day leaks into the ground because of their underinvested, badly maintained pipes. And I know a man that used to be the managing director of BP. And it takes 3 seconds. He goes, Feargal, we could do that job in weeks.
Really?
Do you think that the oil industry would allow 25% of our oil to disappear out of our pipe networks? That's billions of pounds worth of business. So all of this can be fixed by nothing more than putting the grown-ups into the room. And for far too long, it's not even been the primary school children, it's been the nursery school children that have been running this industry. And I'm saying this, by the way, I need to say this. I'm very lucky. I spent 40 years of my life working in the British music industry. Colossal global success story. The level of competency I've encountered in the water industry, you would not be tolerated in the music industry. You'd be gone by lunchtime on Tuesday.
Last question. There's a young lady here in a black top. I'm sorry, everyone else, but she's been waving at me a lot. She's right behind Gerald, and it will have to be the last one, Gerald. It will be the last one, yeah. Your first name, if you would. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Henrika, and I'm a local resident.
Okay.
And we should go to Sweden, by the way. I'm from Sweden, so I think
you should go to Sweden.
Sweden. We should go to Sweden
Keep
to look for a solution, like the previous question. Now, I just have a question about wet wipes.
Yes.
I read somewhere, and I don't know if it's true. I don't use them. I think they're hateful things. Is that you are not allowed to sell them, but you're still allowed to produce them. Is that really true?
We're talking wet wipes.
Wet wipes.
Okay.
I mean, surely wet wipes, if we can just take them off the shelves, stop producing them,
well, let me try this one. Such is the level of incompetency of the water industry. Their trade body, Water UK, 2 or 3 years ago, did work with some of the wet wipe manufacturers, I believe, to create a biodegradable wet wipe that would dissolve in water. Even they disowned that about 3 months ago because it doesn't work. The simple truth is we need to ban wet wipes. That's the end of it. Conversation finished. I'm pleased to say that someone I know that's campaigned on this furiously is Fleur, the new MP, has just been re-elected again and is back in Parliament, and I have absolutely no doubt Fleur will be gearing up to push her private member's bill again and get wet wipes banned, because they just need to be banned.
Listen,
there's no need for them.
Ladies and gentlemen, your appreciation for someone, he's not going away like a wet wipe, the smartest dressed anarchic revolutionary I've ever seen. Feargal Sharkey, your appreciation if you would. Well done, buddy. Well done. Gerald.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to go to the pub, and I hope Feargal will hang around and answer questions. We have a reception at the back of the church. Please join us. 1 or 2 thank yous. Obviously, the Tom Olsen Lecture was put in place by Tom, and the Trust covers the cost of this so that we can come together and have these conversations. So I'd like to thank the Trust and also the partner for the drinks you're going to enjoy afterwards, Kaizo, who have been associated with this lecture for the last 5 or 6 years. But most of all, before I thank our speaker and guest, I'd like to thank you for coming, because without you, we'd be talking to ourselves. And would I please ask you to put your hands together, first of all, to Feargal for sharing his knowledge and his passion. And also to Nick Ferrari, who has done his usual forensic examination of the issues, balanced, but in his favour. Please thank Nick Ferrari.